Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, January 16th. I'm Eric Rickenberger. This is SIG Testing's weekly meeting. This is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube shortly. On today's agenda, I wanted to talk real briefly about the process of rolling out automation changes. Tim St. Clair raised the idea of where are we going to put out sort of sub-project breakouts and how are we going to do that. Matt Landis is going to follow up on the idea of a co-working day for SIG testing in Seattle. And Tim has a question on Basil. So first and foremost, rolling out automation changes across the project. We had a lively discussion during the community meeting last week about where the best place to roll out and discuss automation changes was. Feedback I have gotten from the community as I've been trying to one by one enable Tide for certain repos is that people don't like being voluntold process changes. Things that have been done in the past that have caused some friction for people are things like having 80 plus labels added to their repo unannounced, or having a bot start commenting on a bunch of stale issues and PRs unannounced in a way that they had no warning and couldn't really reconfigure the bot or disable the bot against their repo. This then started a lively discussion about what it means to be a part of the Kubernetes project and whether or not there should be standard policies and procedures and automations that are expected of every repo in the project. And I think that discussion is still ongoing and needs to find a home. And my suggestion was that the contributor experience special interest group would be the best place to have that discussion. But I do think that we as a group, when we roll out things that could potentially affect the way automation works on the project or some of the high traffic repos, need to do a better job of giving a heads up to the broader community, call the shot, take the shot sort of things. And we have gotten better about it, but I still think that sometimes we could be rolling out traffic to Kubernetes or putting some traffic on the Kubernetes dev mailing list before we actually roll stuff out. It's also really helpful to be able to have an issue to link to that describes the what and the why. Tim, question.
It's a comment. I don't think Contribex has the right to dictate, to outline policy. They can maybe craft language for policy and enforce it, but I think it needs to be approved by steering committee and how it gets, not only what the policy is, as well as how the policy will be enacted. Because we're a super huge project now, and having sort of a tiered pilot model, as like Michelle likes to reference it as, helps to sort of eliminate friction. Having like known opt-in folks who would want to be the guinea pigs to volunteer to do quick feedback on whatever process changes we want to make. And then, then do a stage 2 and a stage 3. But I don't think that's even Contribex's responsibility. I think that needs to be driven by the steering committee because it affects the entire the entirety of Kubernetes, which is a lot of things. And until Kubernetes is like an actual finite defined thing, because right now the org houses like everything and its brother, I think that's it's cart before the horse. I think people can absolutely opt into whatever they want to opt in. That's their choice. But I don't think policy can be defined by Contribex.
So to be clear, I wasn't entirely talking about policy, although I do think substantively that's the place to talk about the contributor experience, but more around how we actually decide to roll out changes to our automation. Because I think in the past we've just rolled them out in the name of agility and innovation and tend to prefer to ask for forgiveness rather than, giving even an advance heads up, let alone asking for permission. So specifically for me, trialing repos with Tide, I have been asking in the form of issues and pull requests, which repo owners are free to refuse to merge or, have a dialogue there. That to me has seemed to be the most direct place to have a conversation with people who have purview over that repo.
And that's a total opt-in mechanism. The point I'm trying to make is that enforcement of tooling and labels is a policy change, right? And we can't enforce policy on what is quote unquote Kubernetes until we've actually defined what is Kubernetes. Because right now it's many things, it's too many things, right?
Yeah.
So and then we'd also have to figure out what does it mean to be enforcing these things, right?
Sorry, sirens downtown. Yeah, anyway, I wasn't so much talking about enforcement, just about doing a better job of communicating as we change things. I mean, I view it kind of in the context of marketing and communicating and being able to brag about what this group is doing. I think sometimes it can be fun to be the invisible people who just silently make this project work, but it's also pretty cool to get recognition for things that, pointing out when things change for the better. Anyway, that's something I tripped and fell over with Tide, attempting to add that to Helm. It was really fun. I also got a bunch of feedback that we're not documenting what it is we do or how we do it. I'm not sure that's entirely fair, but I do think I can stand to do a better job of attempting to broadcast, market, and communicate what's happening. So things like having a plan for 110 would be super duper helpful for that, to be able to call what we're about to implement rather than just implementing it. But I will get there on that. In the meantime, what I'm concretely working on right now is updating the documentation around owners because it has fallen out of date, and we have added at least one new field to it and taken away one new field from it. So look for a pull request from me shortly on that. Next up, I wanted to hand off to Tim St. Clair to talk about sub-projects.
So I just got feedback from Robert, because I was poking him earlier today, about where he did the PRs. And he did the PRs for cluster lifecycle as working group elements and created them as separate working groups, sponsored by the main thing, even though they're more like sub-projects. So we haven't really defined this space very well. There's stratification for it. There's the SIG, which is the umbrella. Then there's working groups, which are usually cross-functional. They kind of cross SIG boundaries. Then there are sub-projects, which are pretty much owned by the SIG, but they're focused enough to require their own separate thing, right? This kind of falls into the category of sub-project, what we were bantering on the mailing list about, which is basically just having folks focus on just the test and the test frameworks. But there isn't really good community pulls for that, but I could easily community pull as a working group and then put a note inside there that there's no documentation for how this is done formally.
Okay, so I posted a link in the chat. This was a proposal that was floated through SIG architecture, authored by Brian Grant and Matt Farina, as part of this month's steering committee sprint. It is on me to attempt to implement some of this. This whole document talks about things like removing the concept of maintainers from our community membership ladder, and syncing GitHub teams from checked-in files, and a bunch of other stuff that I just won't have the time to implement in the next 2 weeks. The first step that I wanted to take was updating the sigs.yaml file that lives inside of the Kubernetes community repo, from which all of the SIG documentation is generated. And I wanted to add the concept of a sub-project field to that. So as called out in this document, the idea of a sub-project is it's something that has one or more owners file, has a name, and it has one or more owners files, as defined by a list of URLs to those owners files. The idea here is that some sub-projects may be able to map cleanly to a single repo. Helm, for example, is probably its own sub-project, whereas other sub-projects like the workload APIs are spread across a number of different subdirectories inside one or more repos. And so those will need to be called out as such. The community ladder also calls out the concept of an owner separate from a maintainer. There is no technical difference from either of those from an approver as far as our automation is concerned, but it might be useful to add that as a separate field to owners files for us to make some differentiating behavior down the line.
So I'll just jump in on that real quick. This is Matt. When we talked about the difference between a maintainer and an owner, the maintainer has write privileges to the repo. And one of the things that was suggested was that if you knew who the maintainers were, you could have automation go ahead and manage that list in GitHub and that write access automatically. So that way you have it not only documented who has the right access, which we don't in many places today, it also gives you the ability to control that through automation and pull requests in code. And that was one of the things we had talked about in SIG or in SIG architecture.
Okay. I mean, I would be happy just getting the list of the sub-projects and owners files into SIGs and document it so that I could point to any SIGs README file, and in there I could see a name, I could see a list of all of the names of the sub-projects, and then pointers to owners files. And then down the line, we can add automation to create GitHub teams based on owners files, maybe those, maybe something else. We can enforce that somehow those owners files end up linking back to and are correctly populated at the destinations, things like that. But the goal for right now, I'm trying to see if this satisfies, I guess, Tim's request, is just to list the sub-projects. So I'm taking the lead on implementing that, and I think I need to get an authoritative list from Brian Grant, although I'm open to suggestions.
I think what I'll do is I'll read through that doc in more detail, and I'll create the PR for it, and I'll outline who the people are and who are the listing in the owners files, and the locations of the owner files, one of which have not been done yet because we're still waiting on the repo for test frameworks. But that directly relates to this work.
So on the test frameworks repo, I have created that repo, and I have added the two individuals who initially proposed creating that repo for their integration test frameworks as admins, and I've created an admins team for that. Where I am blocked right now is we had talked about having testing.kates.io/frameworks redirect to that repo, which matters to them just in terms of what they call their Golang packages, right?
Where is that repo located at? It's not.
Give me a moment. Pasted a link to it in chat.
Okay.
So yeah, I've been trying to guinea pig that repo and that org as the standard for how repos should be implemented and how GitHub org should be implemented if we were to go down the path of having a GitHub organization per SIG. Let's see. Matt, did you want to, Tim, did I answer your question sufficiently? Can we move on to the next topic? Okay, seeing a nodding of head. Matt, did you want to talk about co-working day?
Yeah, so last meeting we had talked about having a co-working day in Seattle. I volunteered the Amazon office, so we're working on getting the space secured for that. I didn't know if we wanted to talk about like specifically start times. There's also talk of having a kind of an after social. I don't know, people in Seattle. We can do this over email, or I don't know. I just wanted to call it out, and it's going to be the 26th, and we should probably go into it with some amount of planning. But you guys are much more familiar with the testing stuff happening right now than I am, so I don't know what goals you would want to have come out of like actual getting stuff done during the meeting.
Okay. How about I make sure that that's like an item that we have. I'll go ahead and start planning next week's meeting now, and we can sort of put together a straw man agenda for what we want to work on Friday and discuss that briefly next Tuesday. My understanding is this is going to be in Blackfoot, maybe, or is this?
Blackfoot is where we're at, depending on where we can secure the correct amount of space to be convenient for people to get to. It'll be in the Blackfoot vicinity, if not in Blackfoot itself. So,
but yeah, I think the mailing list is probably the right place to hash this.
Okay.
And then Tim, I think you had a question on where we were at with Basil.
Yeah, I know that we wanted to implement it in 110. But I don't know how it's standing right now.
I've seen chatter in the Basil channel about things being sad lately, but I'm not sure about the specifics.
Chatter about what exactly?
like where are we in general with the state of Basil and Kubernetes and using Basil as the canonical way of building Kubernetes, so on and so forth?
Well, I think it would be kind of a pretty big step to say this is the canonical way, but like most of the builds and infrastructure are Basil builds.
I know one of the, I don't know if Jeff Grafton has vendored it yet, but there had been talk of like, what's the best way to vendor in Gazelle and rules go, stuff like that to make sure we weren't impacted by removing the old rules go repo.
In general, test infra is having quite a discussion around depths, even not necessarily considering Basil, just because like, you know, dep is shiny now, but dep does a very poor job not pulling in the world into your repo, and that causes problems for various things, Basil included. Also just bloating your repo. So that kind of needs sorting. And as far as Kubernetes is concerned for being the canonical build, I think we need like full cross-platform builds. We should have things going in that let you do like Go only binaries, but we have things that pull in CGO, and cross-platform CGO is kind of a mess, just in general. Yeah, dep prune doesn't quite do everything yet. They have some issues upstream about this. They're working on it.
Well, it doesn't help that like our dependency graph for a lot of stuff is like, you know, we don't do data hiding, which like who knew idioms from C back in 1990s were actually a thing, right? So like as a result, we have, you know, import world.
Yeah.
Like the testing framework is import universe. So.
Right.
So just a quick question here. So if we don't actually check, so we check the whole vendor world in already today in something like Kubernetes, right? So what's the difference between dep updating it when we update it versus godep updating it and checking all the vendor in anyway? Or are we looking at a different process for handling dependencies?
We're just talking about that. I think dep does some nice things and people want to use dep, but dep doesn't do a very good job removing extraneous things like test code or like test data, which cause some strange issues. For example, some repos actually have vendored Go tooling that will fix Go code, and it includes test data with malformed Go code. And dep will just kind of like dump the whole repo in vendor, and prune sort of naively removes some things from that, but not very much. So then you run a tool like Gazelle over it to generate build for all the Go code, and it's like, I can't parse this Go code because it's broken. So then you need to add some other process to like remove that bogus code, and there's not a super clean solution right now until things improve with Go's vendoring tools.
Is this a problem for the vendoring tool or for a problem for the upstream code that's actually doing broken Go code?
Well, it's a problem for us doing auto-generated Basil builds.
Okay.
It's trying to generate a build for this code that can't build. Things like that are just...
So Go itself doesn't have a problem when we use it. So Go doing a build and Go packages, if we use Go install to create the packages for it and cache those, doesn't have a problem. This is Basil's having an issue dealing with this code, or is there something with the Go tool?
It's Basil having an issue with this code, but also that like we at least don't want stuff like this in a repo because it's just bloat. You know, you're adding a ton of files to render it. I don't know if the last time you've done like a clean checkout of Kubernetes, but it's a pretty huge Git repo because of stuff like this. There's just tons and tons of Git history going on.
Yeah. In fact, I've had a whole bunch of talks because when you go start stripping files out of repos or making changes to files, does that impact licenses, and what do different companies think about that? And I don't know where everybody stands on it now. The last time I checked on it, I got multiple answers to that question. And so that's why, like in Glide, there was an opt-in tool that lets you went and clean things. Yeah, Glide doesn't prune, but there's actually a tool that somebody created to allow you to opt-in prune. It's called like Vendor Cleaner, and it has different flags depending on what you can do. So your organization can opt into certain kinds of pruning, and that because different people will have different interpretations and different code with different licenses, and you don't want to automatically do anything. You want to be smart about altering code. Is stripping files out altering it or not? Yeah, I'll let lawyers deal with that, and I just kind of step away and deal with options. And that's part of what is going on here.
Yeah.
So it's complicated.
We're also having some issues upstream with depth and with Basil. Maybe some of the Go tooling will be smarter about. Eric has hacked something together for a test info that lets you kind of like auto strip it from the Basil side of things, but it's
Okay.
a bit some shellcode. Hopefully we can like make that feature official.
So seeing how Matt's here, and we're talking about stripping stuff out of the repo. I did a PR maybe like a year and a half ago to remove all of examples, and you're like on SIG apps, and they were supposed to be a separate examples repo that did a PR that got some of the stuff out. And the examples are basically what Jay and I did a long time ago when people wanted to make sure the examples ran, is there's an end-to-end test that does a go bin data, which basically smashes all the YAML from the examples into a ginormous bin data struct, which is then imported and then run as part of the tests. But it's been selectively disabled for some things. And I've wanted to like just rid that piece, that awful monstrosity that was a crib in time out of the repo, but I don't know why it was stopped. Like why is the example stuff not ripped out?
Yeah.
I have no idea.
But so anyhow, definitely we kind of need to sort that out a bit, and we'd like to figure out a good story around being able to build to another platform with SIGO handled.
Do you have a handle on where the SIGO stuff is? Like what part of the code cares about SIGO?
I don't have a particularly great handle on it right now, but I think Jeff has, because he just went through and marked a bunch of binaries that don't have SIGO as pure only for the Basil build. So those can actually be, if you're using relatively recent tooling in a recent checkout, you can build between platforms now.
Okay.
So there's a PR somewhere that goes through and identifies most of the binaries that don't, but there are definitely things like I think the kubelet, off the top of my head, that need to use some SIGO dependencies.
Okay.
Basil has pretty good concepts now around like platforms and architectures and things and tooling for that, and having cross platforms, and will like auto manage your Go tool chains, but it doesn't have a good story for native tool chains or Java tool chains yet. So I'm not sure where we're on that. I'd have to ask Jeff. I also think even if we do get these things sorted out, there definitely has to be like a bigger discussion, like, you know, if people want to start using this. And
the only thing I really care about is that the release artifacts have two different ways of being created, and you cannot produce a canonical binary build from the main repository. You go through the release repository, which then munges through and creates the artifacts that are then used. But those artifacts are not tested as part of the regular test cycle, right? So like we only create the RPMs and the debs at the end of the cycle, and they're not continuously, constantly tested and updated. Which is always funsies. At the end of the cycle, where there's always like a point in time where people panic, and Lucas gets on the horn and fixes all the things. But now Lucas is gone, so let's be smart about it.
I mean, I get that there are a lot of people here that work on Basil, but I also feel like that's a discussion that's best suited for the SIG that's focused on releases. Because I think they own most of the release-based tooling. And if it turns out that their tooling isn't using the right way to build Kubernetes, we should discuss that there. Like, you know, heck, even why not make Debians and Debs and RPMs based on the alpha and beta builds of Kubernetes. So we're actually releasing the builds all the way instead of just binary artifacts.
I think that might actually be because at least the RPMs, I'm pretty sure, only exist as part of the Basil build. And I think most of the official builds right now are all through the like kind of crazy Docker system.
anyway, like I share the enthusiasm for that. Like I said, I think more the fact that nobody really pays attention to this until the very last release is built, when we should be building releases every 2 weeks and calling them alphas and betas and release candidates, seems like we're not exercising all of the release process all the time. And the release SIG could probably stand to hear about that. Okay, we're basically at time here. Anybody have anything else?
Shout out to intern Kwong over here, who has been making your house dashboard look shinier. Hopefully we'll have some more updates on that.
Hello?
I've been dragging him to the meetings now. If you guys have any things that you want fixed with the user interfaces, which are kind of not the best right now, ping him.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm new here.
Sweet. Issues incoming.
Fine, I'll help on the issues to Carl.
All right, cool. Thanks, everybody. Happy Tuesday. See you all next week.
Yeah.